Chapter 6. Hold on. Things got worse for Johnson the next day, November 2nd, the Saturday before the election, when South Vietnam's president made a speech to his national legislature announcing a boycott of the negotiations that the bombing halt had finally made possible.
Thieu says Saigon cannot join Paris talks under present plan,
said the front page headline of the New York Times. The objections Thieu raised were smokescreens. He said he couldn't accept bargaining with the NLF as a separate delegation. The United States wasn't asking him to. Thieu's own "our side, your side" formula took care of that. Saigon's second smokescreen sprang from the first. A separate delegation for the NLF? Thieu said,
would just be another trick toward a coalition government with the communists in South Vietnam.
Johnson had long ago rejected a coalition government with the communists. But the damage was done. Saigon's public boycott of the peace talks made the bombing halt look like a hollow political trick at the expense of an ally in war. Nixon played it beautifully, campaigning in Austin, just a few miles from the LBJ ranch. The Republican nominee said on November 2nd,
"In view of early reports this morning, prospects for peace are not as bright as they were even a few days ago."
As if things didn't look bad enough, Nixon had one of his anonymous minions tell reporters that Johnson had assured all the candidates that South Vietnam would sit down with the NLF in Paris. In fact, LBJ had mentioned in his conference call that the peace talks might not get started, and had a transcript of Nixon acknowledging as much.
"With regard to the talks, if they begin, and as I know, you've made it clear that they may not."
But now a Nixon confidant and highly placed advisor was telling reporters in a memorable turn of phrase,
"We had the impression that all the diplomatic ducks were in a row."
Combined with Thieu's refusal, the anonymous quote made Johnson look deceptive. Instead of getting credit for standing firm until the enemy caved, Johnson was disappearing down his own credibility gap. At 8:34 p.m. that night, the teleprinter at the LBJ ranch came alive with the latest FBI report on the South Vietnamese embassy wiretap.
Mrs. Anna Chennault contacted Vietnamese Ambassador Bui Diem and advised him that she had received a message from her boss, not further identified, which her boss wanted her to give personally to the ambassador. She said the message was that the ambassador is to
hold on, because we are going to win. My boss says hold on. He understands all of it.
She repeated for emphasis that
this is the only message. He said, please tell your boss to hold on.
She advised that her boss had just called from New Mexico.
Here finally was proof of Republican interference with the peace talks. Direct evidence against Chennault, but only indirect evidence against her boss, who was unfortunately not further identified. LBJ's national security advisor tried to track down the reference to New Mexico. Nixon wasn't there, but the campaign plane of Republican vice presidential nominee Agnew had touched down that day at the Albuquerque airport.
The New Mexico reference may indicate Agnew is acting.
Rusto wrote. The dots were nearly connected. Johnson almost had what he needed. At 9:18 p.m., the president called the highest-ranking Republican official in the land, Senate Minority Leader Everett Dirksen.
"I want to talk to you as a friend and very confidentially, because I think that we're skirting on dangerous ground, and I thought I ought to give you the facts, and you ought to pass them on if you choose,"
Johnson said.
"If you don't, why then I will a little later."
The president spent more time complaining about falsehoods Republicans were spreading about him and the bombing halt than about anything else. He walked Dirksen through the negotiating history, stressing that Saigon had agreed to take part in the peace talks before he ordered the bombing halt. Then dropped a bombshell.
"And here is the latest information we got. The agent says that she's just talked to the boss in New Mexico. And that he says that you must hold out, that just hold on until after the election. Now we know what Thieu is saying to them out there.
Yeah.
We're pretty well informed on both ends."
Yeah.
The president complained about the ducks in a row, quote, and Humphrey and Bundy's bombing halt speeches before returning to the point.
"Some of our folks, including some of the old China lobby, are going to the Vietnamese embassy and saying, please notify the president that if he'll hold out until November the 2nd, they could get a better deal." Now, I'm reading their hand, Everett. I don't want to get this in the campaign.
That's right.
And they oughtn't to be doing this. This is treason.
I know.
Once again, the president went directly from evidence of sabotage of the Paris peace talks back to that day's attack on him by the Nixon campaign. When he returned to the evidence, he not only threatened to go public, but he exaggerated how much he knew.
Now, I can identify them because I know who's doing this.
Dirksen attempts to interject.
I don't want to identify it. I think it would shock America if a principal candidate was playing with a source like this on a matter this important.
Yeah.
I don't want to do that. But if they're going to put this kind of stuff out, they ought to know that we know what they're doing. I know who they're talking to, and I know what they're saying. And my judgment is that Nixon ought to play it just like he has all along, that I want to see peace come the first day we can, that it's not going to affect the election one way or the other. The conference is not even going to be held until after the election.
Yeah.
They have stopped shelling the cities. They have stopped going across the DMZ. We've had 24 hours of relative peace. Now, if Nixon keeps the South Vietnamese away from the conference, well, that's going to be his responsibility. Up to this point, that's why they're not there. I had them signed on board until this happened.
Yeah, okay.
Well, now, what do you think we ought to do about it?
Well, I better get in touch with him, I think, and tell him about it.
I think you better tell him that his people are saying to these folks that they oughtn't go through with this meeting. Now, if they don't go through with the meeting, I don't think it's going to be me who's hurt. I think it's going to be whoever's elected, and it'd be, my guess, him.
Yeah.
And I think they're making a very serious mistake, and I don't want to say this, and you're the only one I'm going to say it to.
While the FBI report said Chennault's boss was not further identified, at times in the conversation the president implied that it was Nixon. At other times in the same call, however, Johnson implied that Nixon didn't know about it and needed to be told.
Well, I'll try to find them, wherever they are tonight.
Dirksen said. The conversation made the president's priorities clear. He used the leverage the FBI report gave him to pressure the Republicans to stop doing two things that were damaging his image and his historic legacy. He was firm about both. The Republicans must stop publicly saying that he had misled them about the bombing halt and must stop secretly encouraging Saigon to stay home from the Paris talks. The South's boycott and the Nixon campaign's aspersions on the bombing halt negotiations made LBJ look like he was playing politics with peace when he wanted to be seen as the president who held the line on Vietnam. To fight these threats to his reputation, he brandished the ultimate threat to Nixon's exposure of the Chennault affair. Humphrey's campaign, however, was not a priority. The only time LBJ mentioned him was to complain about his bombing halt speech. Dirksen managed to reach Nixon at the Century Plaza Hotel in Los Angeles, but the Republican nominee didn't call the president right away. On November 3, the Sunday before the election, Nixon appeared on NBC's Meet the Press, where he made a seemingly generous offer. Nixon volunteered
To go to Saigon or Paris after the election to get these talks off dead center.
Nixon had thought of a brilliant way to get credit for solving the problem that Johnson suspected him of creating. The nominee made it sound like he'd be doing the president a favor.
I am simply indicating that I will cooperate in any way President Johnson determines will be helpful. I am not going to sit out there and wait and let him stew in his juice and then hope to try to do it after January.
Together, Nixon said,
We will present a united front.
journalists started to stop letting the Nixon advisor who made the ducks in a row comment hide behind anonymity. It was Robert Finch, a politician skilled enough to get more votes as the Republican nominee for lieutenant governor of California in 1966 than Reagan got for governor.
Finch told two reporters that South Vietnam's refusal to join the Paris talks was evidence that Mr. Johnson had ordered the bombing pause unilaterally and hastily to further the Humphrey candidacy.
The Times reported. Nixon didn't exactly defend Johnson on Meet the Press.
I don't make that charge. I must say that many of my aides and many of the people supporting my candidacy around the country seem to share that view. They share it, I suppose, because the pause came at a time so late in the campaign. But President Johnson has been very candid with me through these discussions, and I do not make such a charge.
Behind the scenes, Nixon once again called on Senator George Smathers, the conservative Florida Democrat, to act as his intermediary with Johnson. Through him, Nixon added another name to the mix. On the phone with Johnson, Smathers said,
Nixon told me that you were getting ready to blast him with the accusation that he had connived with John Tower and Anna Chennault to bring about the action of the Saigon government in not participating. and that he thought that if you blasted him, he felt like that would be, of course, unsupported by the truth, and secondly, unfair, and thirdly, unfortunate.
Johnson, of course, had not mentioned Tower. The president didn't get distracted by this new variable, noting only that the Texas Republican had unfairly called the bombing halt unilateral and unconditional. While talking with Smathers, however, Johnson did concede a key point about Nixon.
Now, I don't know how much he knows.
The president said. That was a step back from what he'd implied to Dirksen the night before, and a step closer to the evidence LBJ had in hand. Soon after LBJ hung up with Smathers, Nixon called.
I just wanted you to know that I feel very, very strongly about this, and any rumblings around about somebody trying to sabotage the Saigon government's attitude there certainly have absolutely no credibility as far as I'm concerned.
The Republican nominee said.
I'm very happy to hear that, Dick, because that is taking place. Now, here's the history of it,
Johnson said. Instead of talking about Chennault, however, the president started in on Finch.
The UPI ran a story quoting, I guess it was Fink.
LBJ knew how to pronounce Finch's name. He'd pronounced it correctly, like the bird, earlier that day. But for the rest of this conversation, it was Fink. Nixon didn't correct him. Once again, Johnson read parts of the UPI story aloud, and once again he summarized the negotiating history of the bombing halt.
Then the traffic goes out that Nixon will do better by you. Now that goes to two. I didn't say, as I said to you the other day, I didn't say that it was with your knowledge. I hope it wasn't.
No.
But,
Well, as a matter of fact, I'm not privy to what you were doing, of course, with this thing, but
Well,
the whole point is this. I think one thing we have to understand here is that, and I know that there's a hawk-dove complex out there as there is here, and that everybody's been saying, well, now, after the election, what will happen? And of course, there is some thought that Hanoi would rather deal now than deal later. They think Nixon will be tougher, and I understand that. And I think that's one of the reasons you felt you had to go forward with the pause. But my point that I'm making is this, that my God, I would never do anything to encourage Hanoi. I mean, Saigon not to come to the table, because basically that was what you got out of your bombing pause. That, good God, we want them over in Paris. We've got to get them to Paris, or you can't have a peace.
The conversation is as revealing for what Nixon didn't say as for what he did. The historian Robert Dallek overstated the case when he wrote,
On November 3rd, Nixon called Johnson and categorically denied that he was doing anything to disrupt the peace negotiations.
Nixon made no categorical denial. First, he said that the charge of Republican sabotage had.
Absolutely no credibility as far as I'm concerned.
Lies can be credible if they are believed. Truths lack credibility if enough people doubt them. Second, Nixon's laughing no, being a sentence fragment, is open to several conflicting interpretations. Finally, when Nixon said he would never encourage Saigon to stay away from the peace talks, that was a conditional denial, not a categorical one, and it didn't even address the question of whether he already had encouraged South Vietnam to boycott the peace talks. These were non-denial denials, as Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein would learn to call the ambiguous White House statements about their Watergate stories. Johnson, for his part, did not ask Nixon if he was involved in the Chennault affair. He didn't accuse Nixon either. Instead, the president repeated his complaints about Thieu and Fink. He did not, however, repeat the threat he'd made to Dirksen the night before. In his last phone call to Nixon before the election, LBJ said nothing about going public with the information he had. Nixon mollified the president, complimenting Austin, the future home of the Johnson Library, as
Beautiful city.
mentioning that he told the host of Meet the Press that.
LBJ got a bad rap on Vietnam.
He suggested that
The president can negotiate peace in Vietnam during the final 2 months of his term.
and took a little crack at Humphrey's entourage.
Some of Humphrey's people have been gleeful, and they said the bombing pause is going to help them and so forth. And our people say it hurts, and
well, I'll tell you what I say. I say it doesn't help, doesn't affect the election one way or the other.
I don't think it does.
Because I've asked all the candidates to please support me. And the other day, all three of them said, you let it off, but all three of them said, we'll back you, Mr. President.
That's right.
So I say it oughtn't affect the election one way, and I don't think it'll change one vote.
Well, anyway, we'll have fun.
Thank you, Dick.
Bye.
When he finally hung up, Mr. Nixon and his friends collapsed with laughter.
Wrote Godfrey Hodgson, who covered the 1968 campaign for the London Sunday Times.
It was partly in relief that their victory had not been taken from them at the 11th hour.
Although Johnson expressed certainty to Nixon that the nominee himself wasn't undermining the peace talks, he had his doubts. Afterward, he told his Secretary of State,
Now, I don't know whether he knows. I don't want to question his sincerity, whether he knows what they're doing or not. But it's pretty obvious to me that they've had their effect.
The final Gallup poll of the campaign showed the race too close to call. Nixon 42%, Humphrey 40%, and Wallace 14%.